Okay, in this video I just want to have a bit of a discussion about how the exchange rate can impact on some of the goals, focusing mainly on the current account because we have looked at the impact the exchange rate has on the other goals in previous chapters, but it is something that you need to be able to articulate really specifically as part of this chapter. So firstly, when you're looking at the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth and full employment, again, you've got to be able to make that distinction between price takers and price makers. So those who sell products whose prices are determined on world markets. So if we're selling something in American dollars, so let's say a farmer, or a farmer in this case, sells 1,000 tonnes of wheat at $300 US per tonne. So he's getting $300 US per tonne that he sells, and because $1 Australian dollar is equal to $1 American dollar, he's also getting 300 Australian dollars. But if suddenly the Australian dollar depreciated and now $1 Australian dollar was only purchasing 50 US cents, well, if he's selling that product for 300 US dollars, he's now receiving twice as much money as what he used to. So instead of receiving the traditional 300,000, he'd receive 600,000, say he sold 1,000 tonnes. So price takers benefit because they get more income because of the lower Australian dollar when they sell products. And that leads to increased incomes and increased growth because of increased consumption for price takers, like in the mining industry. Price makers, if you're in an industry where you're a price maker, basically whatever you're selling becomes more competitive. Because if you keep your price exactly the same in Australian dollars, the foreign currency now has more purchasing power, so it's cheaper for foreigners to come to Australia. That leads to tourism exports, it leads to increased education, and that helps to boost aggregate demand as well. Import competing businesses, they also benefit because it's cheaper for Australians to buy Australian products than it is to buy the equivalent imports from overseas, and again that helps to boost net exports because we're buying Australian rather than overseas products. From a supply side impact, the lower dollar can have negative impacts because it increases the cost of intermediate inputs, and because we rely so heavily on intermediate and capital goods, that can lead to higher prices, shift the supply curve to the left and have negative impacts on demand. But overall, a lower dollar is good for both growth and full employment because the demand side impact is stronger. So in recent times, the lower dollar has helped to rebalance growth away from the towards the non-mining sectors because it's boosted demand for education, tourism and things like that. In terms of the impact on price stability, again, we've sort of covered this in other chapters, but an appreciation helps to reduce net exports and therefore reduce demand pull inflationary pressures, and it also leads to weaker, lower incomes which reduce demand as well. From the impact on the supply of an appreciation is the opposite. So if we have an appreciating dollar, that should help to reduce the cost of production for businesses using imported capital, and again will help to reduce the CPI. Because a lot of finished goods, so things that we're buying directly from overseas, so say I'm buying a PlayStation or something from overseas, that gets included in our CPI. So if there's a lower cost of things like PlayStation, that also makes the CPI go down directly rather than just affecting cost of production. In recent times, the fall in the exchange rate has added to inflationary pressures, but not enough that it's put inflation beyond our target range. There's been a whole range of other things, including low wage growth, strong competition for jobs, low confidence, and so on and so forth that have helped to keep inflation low despite the higher dollar. In terms of the impact on the current account, okay, this is the most important part in terms of this chapter. When the Australian dollar appreciates, it means that exports that are price takers receive less income for their exports. So if I'm selling a product overseas and the Australian dollar goes up, so if it's buying in, say it costs 100 US dollars, I'm now going to get less Australian dollars for that export when I convert it back to Australian. Exporters who are price makers experience a decrease in their competitiveness, and that leads to less credits and more debits in the balance of merchandise trade and net services as well. So overall, an appreciating dollar is bad for the balance of merchandise trade. Import values increase as they're cheaper, and export volumes go down. This is bad for the current account. In terms of when the dollar depreciates, it has the opposite effect. Exporters that are price takers, so if prices are denominated in foreign currency or on world markets, they receive more income. And exporters that are price makers, like tourism and education, will experience increased international competitiveness, more credits and less debits in the balance of merchandise trade. Import values will decrease because it'll be more expensive to buy things from overseas, and we'll choose locally made products instead. A higher Australian dollar is therefore good for the current account in the sense that it reduces the interest Australians pay on their foreign debt if denominated in foreign currency. So while a high Australian dollar is bad for the balance of merchandise trade, it does have some benefits for the net primary income section because we pay less interest. But overall, the dollar appreciating is bad for the CAD because the balance of merchandise trade impact is bigger than the impact on the net primary income. In recent times, the high value of the dollar up until 2013 caused the CAD to increase, but then it started to lower again once we had the depreciation of the Australian dollar in 2013 and 2014. In terms of the impact that the CAD and net foreign debt can have on the Australian dollar, this is really important, is that a higher current account deficit or a low value of the CAD generally leads to an increase in the Australian dollar, whilst a high CAD, so a high current account deficit, will depreciate the dollar. And there's reason for that is because when the current account deficit is high, it's generally a sign that there's higher risks investing in Australia. So a couple of people overseas might decide not to buy a property in Australia or buy investments in Australia because we have that extra risk associated with investment. It's also a sign that our tradable sector is doing quite poorly, so that may be a sign that the Australian dollar is likely to depreciate as well, as there's less demand for exports, so more supply and less demand for the dollar. A high Australian dollar can exist with a low CAD. It can happen, and that will generally occur when there's really strong export demand, and therefore that's caused the dollar to appreciate, like at the height of the mining boom. And the CAD is low because we're getting such a high volume and value of exports coming into the country. So when the commodity prices were really high, it led to a high dollar and also a low CAD because of the impact that caused because of what caused the exchange rate to go up in that case. So a summary of the impact higher CAD and net foreign debt on the dollar. A higher CAD and net foreign debt can lead to foreign investors reducing their exposure to Australia. They're likely to sell their investments in Australia. It's likely to lead to large capital outflows because they don't want to be invested in Australia. We also need to pay interest on our loans, so that can lead to more debits in the current account and therefore more supply of the Australian dollar. And it may lead to a refusal to lend to Australia altogether, so there'll be less capital inflow as well because we're not getting any money from overseas. So to summarise, when the CAD and net foreign debt are high, it leads to large capital outflows because people don't want to invest in Australia, so they get rid of their investments in Australia. It leads to higher amounts of interest that we're paying on borrowed funds, which increases supply of the dollar. And it can also lead to a refusal to lend to Australia, which means there's less demand for the Australian dollar. Thank you.